Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Talking Over Making Comics. This is episode 4, Idea to Story. And today we're going to be looking at a video I did of me working on a poster for the upcoming comic book series that I'm making called White Cell Re-Evolution. And in the poster, it's going to consist of all the main characters that appear in the series. So I wanted to show you guys how I went about making the poster and talk about the early process of developing a comic book and where you take your idea and you turn it into a story or a series. So we'll just dive right in and I'll begin working on this rough that I had created for the poster. So as I was nearing the end of completing the first book of this series, I thought it'd be a good idea to kind of make an art pinup or a poster that sort of showcased all the characters in the book. That way I can get it out there to people so they can kind of get an idea of what the story's like or what the comic's about. And I think, it's always good to keep in mind that if you are producing your own comics and self-publishing your own books, that creating content alongside of the actual comic book is a great way to keep your project accessible to your audience, people that are interested in your projects, what you're working on. So I'm always keeping that in the back of my mind when I'm working on my stuff, is I want to make things so that people can stay in touch with what I'm doing. And that way you create sort of a, somewhat of a fan base, or just at least a relationship with people that are interested in all the art that you're creating in your comic book. So that was the idea behind this poster. So I have sped up this video. I think it was like a 2.5 hour long video. So I sped it up so that way it's a little bit more compact and you guys can see from start to finish. But really today I wanted to talk about creating, taking your idea and then creating the comic book from an idea and where you kind of go with it, and the sort of steps that I take when I'm plotting a story, or even just kind of brainstorming the type of story I want to tell, the next project maybe. And I mentioned before, I have like a whiteboard in my office here that I use to write down project ideas, whether it's a title or characters or just simple like hooks or ideas I think might be interesting. But often I find that, and so recently I was thinking about how I begin projects and what sort of processes I use to develop a story and then get it ready and prepared for a script stage. Uh, I was trying to figure out a way that I can explain it, maybe find a way to streamline the process even for myself so that it makes it easier every time I go in and begin a new project. So something that I thought about was, usually it starts with an inspiration of some sort. I know a lot of you guys that are developing books find inspiration in a variety of different things. I often will find inspiration in things like video games or even movies, things like that. And once I'm inspired, that's when I decide I'm going to tackle that inspiration by developing a comic story that does it rarely does it like reflect the subject that inspires me. Like the story itself isn't what I try to replicate. It's just like the mood or the feeling that you get when you're watching, the movie or show or whatever. The use of cinematography in film is a good example of how I get inspired by, movies and stuff like that. You often will find like a sort of feeling or like a mood that you find really interesting, and you feel like maybe you could tell a story using a similar approach. And so a lot of times that is what is the driving force behind creating a new series for me. I want whatever story I'm going to tell to have a mood or a vibe so that the reader, when they're reading the series, they sort of get pulled in to that world. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when you're creating stories, because the story will have a character. When you think in your head about like movies that you love or video games, they all have this sort of character behind the the whole project, like this sort of um, personality. And so those are the kinds of things that I think are important when deciding what sort of stories you want to tell, because those are the things that the reader are going to connect with the most, and those are the types of things that you want to make sure that you're bringing to the table in your own story. It sets you apart. It kind of allows you to be unique and your stories to stand out. Okay, so I wanted to take a second here and talk about the video when I'm working on this poster here. You notice I'm sort of struggling with the pose and this arm and the perspective and how he's going to hold this gun. And I remember when I was working on this, I wanted to make sure I talked a little bit about, when you're struggling and you're making your mistakes, and how you need to just sometimes push through it until you find a solution that works. Because I know that it's for some artists. I know for myself in the beginning of making comics, there was so many times where I would, in the rough stage, I would have something down and I would scrap it or I would start again. And that's sometimes you need to do that. But I also found that it's so often that you can, if you push through and you just sort of keep working it, you'll get the results that you want. So I wanted to stress that and encourage artists that are maybe starting out to just see what happens when you sort of keep working with it. You don't give up on the piece. Don't give up on like kind of the your intention of what you wanted to do, because sometimes working through it, you get results that are better than you anticipated, or you learn a lot through working, through it. There are a lot of ways that you can get better as an artist. You can practice, you can do, all these practice sheets. And I've really just personally found that I think I made the largest steps in improving my art through just working through challenges and not giving up and then making them work. Because those are the ones that I think register in your memory and your mind the longest. I think that, when you're confronted with a difficult challenge and then you just figure out a way to make it work, to me is more successful than just, doing sheets of practice, from reference or whatever you're doing, which, I mean, that stuff's great. That stuff helps. But I don't know, I found more results from working through your own challenges as you're creating art pieces. So bouncing back to, ideas and then creating stories from them, narrowing it down to a sort of a process and, creating a script from an idea. I would start out again with, you know, get a feeling or a vibe for the story that you want to tell. Get like colors in your mind of like how you want the comic to look in appearance, like in colors, the palette, or the style of the art, and then the tone of the story. Every story and every movie and comic book has a tone to it, that's begins to be recognizable too for readers. That they sort of associate a sort of mood with your story. And if you begin there, it'll give you a good foundation for your series to sort of, you know, to live on. And it will keep things consistent too for your readers. And another important thing to consider when you're starting out and you're planning things for your book is figuring out what sort of format you're going to be using for your comic. Is it going to be an ongoing? Is it going to be a mini series, a maxi series? All that sort of thing is important to kind of figure out, because when it comes down to breaking down the plot and breaking down the pages, chapters, all that sort of thing, it's important to sort of figure out beforehand what it's going to be as a series. And all of that is just to help get your mind in the right like mindset, so that as you're going through the process, you sort of stay on track. And when you're talking about what type of things you want to write about in your story, or what sort of problems you want to tackle, I remember hearing from, who was it that said, Scott Snyder, I think, was the one that was mentioning, when you're thinking about writing a comic, what you got to ask yourself, what are you afraid of? And it's a great starting point to create an interesting story. So you can think of like your fears, or what is exciting to you as a viewer, or like a hook, like something that will sort of be entertaining for the reader, whether it's like at the end of the story or whatever. And all these kind of start formulating and coming together into sort of like a concept. Because prior to the details of like the plot and the things you want to say in a story, and all that is just sort of a concept. And so once you have your concept down, then you should start working into your plot. And then you want to get like all your ideas down on paper. So for me, I use like a large pad, almost like a large sketchbook pad, and I just sort of start writing down all like interesting plot points that I think would work in the story that I'm developing. So interesting hooks that can make for an interesting read. And then I start developing the world. And I think that it's common that when someone's come up with a story, they revolve the story around the characters, and sometimes the world around the character gets sort of pushed to the side a bit, because when you're telling a story, the world is such a key part of creating that immersive experience for the reader. So once you have your concept kind of figured out and you have the world, now it's time to like kind of get like the characters that you think would fit, and the characters that you're going to find really interesting. um, Give them their weaknesses, give them all of their personality traits that are going to make the character interesting, and get it all written down, because now it's going to be the time where like you want to start gathering your plot. So when planning how you're going to go about making the comic, an average comic is between 20 to 22 pages roughly, and an average arc, or sometimes like a graphic novel, is roughly between 5 and 6 issues. So this gives you sort of an estimate as to how much space you have to put your story, and how you can figure out how many books it's going to take to tell the story. And so for me, for this book, White Celery Evolution, as an example, I broke it into two. I'm breaking it into two small graphic novels. It's going to be like book one, book two. Each one of those books is roughly going to be between 80 and 90 pages. And so these are kind of the steps that I take when I'm beginning to plan, and start to actually like get down on paper the plot. So knowing that the first book's going to be around 80 pages, that tells me that I have between 3 and 4 issues worth of story to be made there. And what I literally do is on a giant pad, I will write down and graph out each individual issue, chapter, and then I also, in those chapters, I'll break it down and say, okay, well, I got like 20 pages per chapter, and then in those 20 pages, I know how many panels. So I usually, on an average, you go about 5 panels per page, and so separately, I will write down all of those factors. Meanwhile, on another page in my pad, I'll begin breaking down, or at least trying to line up story points uh, with what I have laid out as far as the comic, as far as how many panels, how many pages, things like that. And I just sort of start telling that story and make adjustments as I go, knowing all the while like how much space I have on each page. I do a lot of it mentally. I visualize a story. I had asked on Facebook the other day, what sort of topics would some of like my artist friends and things like me to talk about. And a friend of mine, Ryan Cummins, asked, when drawing from my own writing opposed to drawing from another script. Well, that's something that I guess it plays a factor in this, because since I'm the one writing and doing the art, while I'm visualizing how it's going to be told, the whole process is going to be a bit more streamlined, because it's one sort of line of thought. So as I'm writing, in my mind, I can closely see how it would appear in the final page. Now, I mean, you're not going to envision, exactly what you're drawing every time, but I mean, you have an idea as to how the artist, it'll be me, is going to approach the artwork. And so, I mean, I find for myself that like when I'm writing, I do so much of the work mentally. Even when I'm writing the script, I don't. I leave notes for myself in the descriptions of the panels and the scenes, because when I revisit those moments in the story, I already had sort of a mental breakdown how it's going to look visually in the comic. And so, in a relationship where you have a writer-artist relationship, most of the thinking and the visualization that the writer does has to be able to write that out, and then it's interpreted by the artist. So sometimes there there might be like, little slight variations, of how it's going to come out in the end, you know, or the way that it's interpreted, it doesn't align exactly with the way the writer envisioned it. So when you're working on your books and you're doing both the writing and the art, it's a little bit more streamlined in the process. So I find that for me, it saves a bit of time in the scripting stage because you're not writing everything out, because you're relying on your ability to tell the story visually with basically, the scenes that you write out. All the detail work will be done when I'm doing the artwork, and I'll just leave notes and things like that. So it's a good question, and I think that for everyone making comics, they're all dealing with their own challenges, and having a soul vision when you're doing the art and writing has its disadvantages as well. There's oftentimes I think that like getting another mind on some of the choices that I make would be helpful to the story. Getting an outside perspective on things is always great. I just think that when you're working on a project, as long as it's not too many people involved, because I think that when you have too much um, um, involvement or too much sort of in the mix, it can overcomplicate things and the vision gets lost. So I think writer artists, as long as they work well together and they kind of share a vision and they communicate that vision to each other, I mean, it's a great way to make comics, and just as it is if you're doing the art and writing. Okay, so yeah, reaching out to some other friends on Facebook. I had a friend of mine, who's been an awesome supporter of my work, so thank you, Sam Powell. But he asked basically what sort of tools I use and why. And so since I work digitally, I've had a lot of people kind of wonder, how do you get into digital, and what sort of stuff do I need to get started? And I'll tell you right now, I'm not a type of person that kind of like tries out a bunch of different tech and tries out all the latest, all the new stuff they got out there. I got a tablet about 6 years ago. It's just a Wacom Intuos, and I've been using that to make comics, and it's just I really like it. But I mean, ultimately, if you're working digital, that's what you need. You need that and some software. I'm using Photoshop. They have a lot of variety of different softwares out there you can use. I know a current trend is you get like an iPad and you have a tablet, and you have a stylus, and there's a lot of like apps in the App Store that you can use for drawing digitally, creating comics, things like that, and all of that. I mean, it works great. It all can do the job, and I've been seeing more and more people online starting to move towards digital, and I love seeing it. I think that as a creator, if you're trying to make comics, it's such a efficient and helpful way to go about producing comics, because the fact that everything's so streamlined, everything is, it's easy to produce the work and move it around across the internet. It's easy to move it around through applications, um, and it makes the process uh, much more enjoyable, because I've done the scanning thing, having to upload every page that you produce, and I've done, the ink work, using the white ink pens and trying to create all these effects. And as wonderful as all the artwork looks when it's finished, there's a lot of effort and a lot of time that goes into the logistics of making comics. And when you're working into digital, it seems to allow you to get more work done without having to go through all of those, those hoops of just getting the project ready for like print. Like you get on your computer, you have all the files, all the pages, they're all organized. You send it over to your printer or um, your digital services like Comixology, and it's sent, and you move on to the next project. And there's definitely room for both in comics, and there's definitely um, appreciation for both. But I find the process of making comics can be grueling. So anything to help you so that you stay productive and continue to produce, in my opinion, is a great advantage. Now, working in the software, you can see while watching this video that most of the work is done just using a basic round brush to do line work, and that's very accessible for someone starting out. It's just practice as much as you can with just a basic line work and all that, and get the feel for the tablet. I know there's a transition for people that are beginning and using the tablet and the stylus, and it is a lot different than working with pen on paper. But it comes with some practice, and you'll have a handle on it, and it becomes natural. So um, there's real no secret trick to drawing digitally. I think that what happens is you start to experiment with other things in that are available to you artistically through Photoshop, like different brushes. Um, so that all comes with time, though. I know when I first started, I didn't deal with any of those like fancy brushes or nothing like that. I just practiced using the tools that um, are essential when it comes to working digitally. And then later, I would experiment with using some fancier brushes and different effects, and also like different textures. And that's something I really, really think is so great about working digitally, is all the different textures that are available to you. You can browse online and just like take photos or find photos of anything, like concrete or whatever is you find interesting, and you can use those textures in ways that like haven't been seen before, maybe. And those are the cool things about working digitally, is there's so many things at your fingertips. But essentially, you should focus on the basics, I think, starting out. If you were to ask me, when it comes to, how would you begin? Just, practice with the pen, do as much line work as you can, and and then you'll be on your way to sort of developing your abilities digitally. Okay, so looking back at the poster piece now, I've finished all the line work. You can see I did like a hard outline on each character to help pop them out. And so in this part of the process, is I'm coming in with the inks now. So I'm going to be doing all like the heavy blacks, shadow work, things like that. And it's important, I think, to break down your process in steps so that you can kind of stay on track, and so that all your work will stay consistent. Um, and just developing whatever sort of method that works for you is another important part of learning digital, because there are a million different ways you can go about making art in these programs, and I think just kind of giving yourself some steps to follow will keep you on the path, so that you can kind of count on that and fall back on those steps when you are trying to create work. I had a lot of fun working on this poster. It actually began as a idea, maybe for like a cover or something. But as I was working through it, I like the composition as sort of like a poster to sort of showcase all the characters of the book. And I had a lot of fun just sort of like finding the placement and trying to like bring out the personality of each character and things like that. It's funny how when you making comics and you write them, and you sort of like come up with them in your mind, and you begin plotting, and then you do the art. And when it's all said and done, you have your final pages done, the lettering's complete. You start reading through your work, the characters start to come alive, and it's such a fascinating um, part of creating comics, and it's definitely a motivator too. I know that once I had that first book kind of finished and I was reading through it, it was just so it was exciting, and it was a drive to keep going. You wanted to tell more. You wanted to you know you wanted to allow other people to sort of read your story and sort of dive into the characters that you've created. And I think when you're doing all this and you're trying to make interesting comic books, keeping in mind the reader is like through every step, through everything you do, just kind of sort of in the back of your mind, remember that someone's going to be reading it. And they always say too, and I've always found this as a value piece of advice, is that if you're not finding what you're doing interesting, the reader won't. If you're not finding a story point that thrilling, then your reader is not going to find it thrilling. And it goes for art too. If you're doing the artwork, if you don't find it, you know, um, dynamic or interesting to look at, the reader won't either. And all that is important, I think, when creating comics and when you're conceptualizing a story. Um, Now, with that said, I know that as a creator, you should be making what is interesting to you, and that goes without saying. But at the same time, if it is interesting enough, you can draw people into what you find interesting. You can draw the reader in to your story because as a comic book creator, it's in a responsibility. I feel that if you're going to be telling stories, you should be telling stories that are worth being told. So a reader will find themselves immersed into your story if you're putting the effort in and you're making it and you're trying to say something unique and you're trying to do something different. It's easy to sort of fall into the tropes that are kind of like the norms, and I think deviating from what people expect is how you start tapping into something original, unique, something interesting. I remember hearing once from the video game creator Hideo Kojima, and he's the creator of the Metal Gear Solid video game series that I'm sure you guys know that I'm a big fan of by now. And he was asked one time, "How do you come up with such like interesting story arcs and interesting um, twists in your stories?" And he just said something I thought was interesting. He said, "You should betray your audience." And so what I took from that was it's not a bad thing to lead your readers into a story where they feel comfortable and where they are connected to the characters, or they think they know where things are going, to do something drastic or do something that is very jarring, because that creates, I think, one, it creates a memorable story, but two, it also shows you your confidence as a creator. It shows you know that the the way that you write your story and what's going to happen is something that you can't predict, or is something that you could never imagine. And I think as storytellers, it's something that we all strive to do, is to tell a story that is going to be something that you have never experienced. And that's near impossible, especially nowadays with how much is out there. I think it's still something to strive for. Flipping the script or whatever, like just really trying to do something that hasn't been um, thought of is the challenge. And I think going in when you're trying to navigate making a comic book and you're trying to develop something unique, it's a good piece of advice is to betray your reader. So that's just something I thought I would include because I found it useful, and I found it something else to add to sort of your inspiration when coming up with stories. Looking at the poster now, I mean, maybe it's a good time to start explaining a little bit of what it is that the White Celery Evolution is all about. It is a sequel to a series called White Cell Inoculation, and that story revolves around the main character's name is Agent Axis, and he is a white cell, so he's like a trained special ops um, infiltrator. And the story is set in our far future, about like 2081, where we're dealing with a multi-strain virus, and the third strain is caused infertility across the country. And so Axis and his team, the inoculation team, if we're talking about the first book, was tasked with sort of securing or developing the perfect vaccine. And they had sort of gathered intel and sort of gathered um, a formula, but it was unfinished. So in the early series, they were out there trying to find someone that can help them, or someone to help them develop, rather, a vaccine or a cure. And so in this book, this kind of takes place about 6 months after the ending of the first book. And this is now introducing two new characters. So in this poster, I'm working on right now one of the new characters. Her name is Naga, and she is also white cell, but she comes from a different unit. She's from the strike unit. and she's a new addition. There's also two other new additions. One, his name is Quinn, and he is the leader of a resistance group called the Geneva's Echo, and they're basically like a surviving resistance group that's trying to aid other survivors that have lived through the first couple strains of the virus and then are surviving on their own. And the other new character's name is Agent Tack, and he is part of the strike team as well as with Naga, and they're basically like a duo that has survived and has met up somewhere in the story with Geneva's Echo. Um, the other characters in this poster here, you have Link, which she's the one dual holding the dual pistols there. She's got the black hair. She was the communications sort of technician in the first series, but with the events unfolding the way they did, she's sort of taken up more of a involving role as like a soldier. And there's also Agent Russell, and he's the guy, the small guy back there holding the shotgun. He's a pilot and also a close friend of Axis, the main character. And down there in the bottom there is Dr. Beckett, and she's a medical compounder, and she was introduced in the first series as well. So that is the team, and they are dealing with sort of like the main enemy that has been overarching both series. They go by the name the West, and they are a sort of like a corrupt governmental regime that had taken advantage of this situation across the country when the viruses outbroke. And they sort of used their power and wealth to sort of gain a foothold as the leadership, as everything in the country started to fall apart, fall on the wayside. They sort of have been trying to find a way to basically take over the entire country. All the survivors, the resistance, they see them for what they are, and they're aware of the sort of manipulative and corrupt power that they are. So they're in resistance to sort of joining them. I would sort of describe it as like a dystopian future sort of action series. But anyway, yeah, I've been having a lot of fun working on it. I'm really happy to be back on, working on another White Cell project. And this poster, I think, does a good job of, showing the characters that make up the story. One last point of discussion I wanted to bring up is I think for all of you guys that are indie creators like me and they're making their own stories, stand by your characters, man. Like, work with them. Like, when you're putting artwork out there, show your stuff. Like, show your characters. I feel like if more of the indie artists and the indie community, I mean, everyone does a great job at making indie books, and I'm always impressed with what I see. But I feel like, try to really keep your characters close to you. Like, keep your stories close to you. Put that out there. Like, there's a lot of fan art out there of the big guys, and it's cool to see. But I really enjoy seeing indie creations. I love seeing creators support their books. Writers are fantastic at supporting their work and their projects. I mean, I more often see the writers online posting all of their creations, all of the stuff that's a part of their stories and their series, and they push it, and I really love seeing that. So I just feel like it's a good idea to definitely get that stuff out there and make sure that you're always supporting your projects and you're creating content for the viewers to see, so that you can pull their attention over to your camp so they can see what's going on with you, and you can share your stories with them and find some new fans, find some new supporters. And I think all around, when it comes to us indie creators and comic book guys, encourage each other to share the original work. And if you come across something that you find really interesting, share it, support it. I think encouraging each other to just produce work that's of high quality is always a good thing. So I'll sort of leave you guys with this. When you're making a comic and you're trying to come up with a story, which is what this whole episode has been about, just make sure that you're telling a story that really interests you, that means something to you. Find like the underlying message or point of the story that you're trying to tell. Because if you're telling a story, you should have a purpose behind it. All great stories. They have a reason to be told. And I think when you're trying to decide what you want to talk about, what you want to do, make sure there's something behind it. And I think you'll find success in a fan base. I think you'll find success in just your own satisfaction while you're making the book. And just sort of use that as a guide when it comes to planning ahead and unfolding your story. All right, looks like I'm wrapping up with the poster now. I've completed all the renders, effects. I'm making a couple selections to add a little bit more, I think, effects to the poster. So thanks again for your support. If you like what you're seeing, please leave comments on my YouTube channel. Ask questions. I'd be happy to answer any kind of questions you guys have for me. I just try to make these videos so that I can offer any sort of experiences I've had or things that help me along the way to help me produce my comics. It's a great goal to have. I think that if you're making comics and you love it, just keep doing it. Don't give up on it, and make sure you're enjoying yourself. Because I think when you're enjoying yourself, it shows. So thanks again, and I appreciate it. And here's one last look at the finished poster. I added a little bit of a color treatment, and I hope you guys enjoyed the video. You can like me on Instagram at Melanshek Nick. I'm on Facebook, and also follow Mindcore Comics where you can find all my books available. Thanks for watching.